we've got three excellent panelists this evening. So going from right to left, so right to my left here is Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, and she is an academic at Royal Holloway University, and she specialises in researching extremism, radicalisation, and gender, and the overlap between those three. And then next, we've got a bonus panelist this evening, which is Erin Stoner, and she's also a researcher, and she's looked into the far right and the Manosphere. And then finally, at the end, we've got Ben Zand. He's an award-winning filmmaker, journalist, and documentary maker. You might have seen some of his documentaries for Channel 4, such as looking into the incel community or looks maxing, and he's looked into a lot of other Manosphere related topics over the past 5 years. So yeah, we're going to hear from all of our panelists, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So maybe we can get started with Ben then. So I know you've looked quite a lot at the experiences of the influenced rather than the influencers themselves. What have you learned from those conversations over the 5 years you've been speaking to people?
All right, I'll sum that up in 10 seconds. Yeah, 10 though, yeah. That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I've looked into the world of kind of like incels, luxmaxers, gooners, people who rent girlfriends. Does anybody know what a gooner is? There's a real divide. You said that too passionately. There's a real divide in the crowd. But no, I think, it's generally like young guys, people, yeah, as I said, we focus specifically on like the kind of influenced is primarily what we do. People who are a bit more redeemable, I guess, because the influencers have always been a bit less interesting to me in the sense that like they're doing it because they make money and they have an audience. It's a bit easier to understand. Trying to understand why it is that people like follow them and what the appeal is has always been way more interesting. And quite often the people we've met tend to be guys who, they might have been bullied in school, kind of didn't really get along with people in their kind of immediate environment. They had trouble meeting women. They were looking for answers. They ended up being quite isolated, using the internet a lot. And they kind of just stumble upon one of many of these supposed solutions to their angst. And that can either lead them to have kind of severe resentment towards women or to go towards looks maxing and thinking they can ascend if they do certain tasks, or they can just shut off altogether and, jerk off 12 hours in the room on every Sunday. But they kind of find these alternative solutions to ultimately what are very kind of human problems of people struggling to come to terms with who they are, where they should get to in life. There's obviously a much darker reality to it, which is what you see with the world of incels, which leads to kind of real world violence, and that resentment kind of festers. I think that the forums are just the worst place of all time, like on the subreddits on Discord, it just pollutes the brain and just pushes them all to madness. And
Erin, so I know you've been looking into what the possible solutions are in terms of greater regulation and what could be done to sort of stop the algorithms from kind of amplifying all those toxic attitudes that you were just describing. What do you think needs to happen?
The sort of underlying thing with so many of these things, and in this regard, I tend to look at the influencers and how they function. So I'm kind of bringing the other side to what Ben looks at. It's this thing of being a misogynist on average is rewarded online. It's something to do if you want to make money, if you want to get attention, because anything that's inflammatory or aggressive or controversial travels super quickly online. And we know in the same way, disinformation travels far faster than something truthful, because looking at something interesting drives engagement. The underlying thing for all of this for me is that algorithms favor people who spread this kind of message. Unless we have social media platforms that are built with this like safety by design in mind, and they don't function in a way that rewards this sort of behavior, we're never going to get to a situation where people aren't wanting to spread content like this. Because whether they're truly a misogynist or not, they get attention and they get money out of it. And that's the thing that needs fixing.
And Liz, so you have kind of explored the real world impacts in terms of the relationship between the Manosphere and the far right. You've looked at whether Andrew Tate can be considered an extremist. What have you learned from that research?
Well, I think so. My research is really interested in masculinities. I'm interested in misogyny. And I became interested particularly in Andrew Tate around the time of the riots after Southport, and those synergies, who was promoting who, the relationships between between Tommy Robinson, who was somebody that I interviewed for the book Extreme Britain, and also this kind of the way that the far right and new outlets for the far right, like active clubs, kind of really focus on the body. So there are influences from the kind of culture that Tate is part of. You know, probably he's getting on a bit now. He's long in the tooth in terms of influences. But, you know, if you think back to those Southport riots when I was watching Robinson videos, you know, Robinson was starting to do things like introduce his videos by saying, oh, you know, just been working out, you know, this is a new thing for him. He's never been interested in sort of his body before, but, you know, he's kind of really sort of trying to buy into this kind of new kind of influencer, body aware culture. And we see that in kind, you know, I mentioned that active club. So this is kind of new in the last sort of few years, and it is international scene of like localized groups of young men, very focused on the idea of fitness for resistance, for civil war. And I'm really interested in the relationships to women in all of these groups. So Robinson is somebody who will talk about protecting women. It's a real theme at the moment in terms of, you know, protecting women from immigrants. Whereas for Tate, all of the good that men can do is in spite of women. You know, it's not about protecting women. Women aren't good enough for men really to kind of be the real men that they need to be. And then in this active club kind of Telegram groups, there's really very little mention of women at all. So I've been sort of interested in these differences and these evolutions between these different types of actors, essentially. That's what's interesting for me.
And it sort of feels a bit like it was maybe a few years ago when Andrew Tate was kind of synonymous with the Manosphere. He was the person everyone was talking about. Teachers were sort of telling us that all their pupils were mentioning his name all the time and wondering what to do about it. But it feels like things have maybe moved on a little bit since then. I mean, who do you guys see as kind of being the main actors at the moment? And what do you think the kind of key or emerging themes are? I mean, essentially, how is the Manosphere evolving? I mean, obviously, Ben, you were looking into kind of Manosphere adjacent sort of areas like looks maxing and so on. Is that kind of a new dimension to it? And what are the other themes and who are the other kind of key players?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, one name that's obviously been very kind of notorious at the moment is clavicular in the world of lux maxing. I think like what's interesting about lux maxing, it's a bit of a kind of gateway drug into the world of the Manosphere, in the sense that like in many respects it's you know, it's going to the gym and doing your hair better and doing press ups, which who can fault that? And then it leads into kind of, you know, bone smashing and potentially lengthening your legs in surgery. So I think like you know, he's a big name at the moment, and he's like a fascinating example of the complexity of it, in that, like, you know, he claims to be kind of non-political. He's, you know, it's hard to know whether is he a performance artist? Is he like actually, does he truly believe what he thinks? Does it really matter? But I'd say lux maxing right now is a big kind of part of people's the mainstream kind of awareness of it has increased in a level that wasn't previously. But there's so many of these figures, you know, and so many of them are kind of profiting in different ways, either through relationship advice. A lot of it isn't massively new, in the sense of like there's always been guys peddling the supposed, you know, pathway to who you should be as a man and how you get women. But I think it's just now on an industrial scale, in conjunction with social media and these kind of message boards, where it just has become an absolute, you know, Louis Theroux did the doc recently on Netflix, just brought it into the kind of public sphere in a way that hasn't previously been the case. But it's all just the adjacent kind of money-making opportunities that come off the back of it. They're all selling some kind of like course you can take to like get your penis to become 12 inches longer or something. So they just got like all these like really strange like business kind of offerings around it. So it's just become a complete industry now that is just mad.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm getting over that comment about yeah. No, but it's completely accurate. And actually, part of the reason that I'm laughing is that the whole ridiculous is, that's part of it. That shock factor, because even if you don't believe it, You might send it to your friend because it's objectively hilarious. And regardless, and this is taking it back to algorithms, you're sending it to a friend, you're still promoting the algorithm, you're still rewarding the content, if that makes any sense. So this is another thing, even if you don't believe the content, and I know I'm guilty of it, I'll see something Manosphere related and I'll go, that's hilarious, what a silly thing to say, and I'll send it to a friend. But that comes back to the fact that it doesn't matter if you believe it or not, the content drives engagement. When it comes to this thing of who's in that sort of sphere now, I think coming back to the kind of like Louis Theroux documentary, HS Tiki Toki is a great example, and a lot of other streamers like him. They don't necessarily market themselves as Manosphere actors as obviously as somebody like Andrew Tate would, but you have this feeling of it's all entertainment, they're all driving to kind of keep people watching their stream, and if being a misogynist is what it takes, then they're quite happy to embrace that. But then you've also got the other side of it. There's this very public, open side, but then there's the flip side where you look at these kind of like message forums that you were just mentioning, these kind of backroom chats that people get into where you have these very extreme ideas where you have kind of like incels hanging out together. Most people function anonymously. There isn't fame, there isn't money. It's essentially a circle of people who, a lot of whom are having mental health issues in their own ways, or experiencing kind of suicidal thoughts. They're very low self-esteem, and they're swapping ideas and essentially pulling each other deeper into this nihilism. So that's the kind of other side of it. You have this really commercialized bit that you'll see if you go on Twitter, but then if you were to get into the backrooms of kind of Telegram, 4chan, that sort of area, you're getting this slightly more anonymized, darker content.
And some of that kind of then it sort of bleeds into criminality and so on, and there's online gangs and everything. And yeah, so you mentioned the Louis Theroux documentary, and I'm going to take a wild guess that I'm not the only person who's watched that recently here. So I'm just interested to get your initial kind of thoughts about it. And also, I mean, you were talking as well about kind of some of the issues with giving people a platform. Is something like this on such a huge scale? It's, you know, it's Netflix, it's Louis Theroux, so it's got a huge cut through. Is this a helpful contribution, or does it kind of give them the oxygen of publicity?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I watched it and I enjoyed it, and Louis does his thing. A lot of my kind of colleagues in the gender space were very angry about the documentary because, once again, it didn't focus on women as victims, the same as with adolescents, that, you know, people are always fascinated by men as perpetrators. And I think there is definitely a point there. As a 90-minute documentary, women are being forced off platforms, they are being silenced, particularly younger women are really changing their behaviours. And we did see women in that documentary, but there wasn't a sort of great reflection there, so he could have done more. But I think, for me, what was quite interesting about this was also kind of class and race in Louis's encounters with these guys, because these were guys that he has talked about coming from, you know, poor backgrounds, being mixed race. He's coming from a place of incredible privilege. So I was also quite interested in that dynamic between him as the researcher and his encounters with these young men. Because for me, what is really important here is that, you know, we often talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about the manosphere and incels, but this misogyny, which is not about hating women, it's about controlling them and asserting men's dominance. This is everywhere. It's not just a feature and focus of these particular men. You know, it's in the platforms, it's in the AI chatbots, it's in the police who never took those young women who said Tate was a rapist when he was on Big Brother, that never got to court so that he is where he is now. It's in all of those structures. And so yes, it was fascinating. Yes, a lot of people would not have heard anything about this before, and I found it very entertaining. But there are some questions there, I think, about how we understand how misogyny functions and the ethics of doing that, given that he became part of those programs. And they've got a huge amount of attention in an attention economy, which makes them money, because this is all monetized. Misogyny is totally earning people money. So that's my rant about that.
Yeah, I mean, I make similar documentaries, so I mean, I would I have made that doc? Yes. I think like it's a fine balance in the sense of like, you yeah, do you platform people? Do you kind of challenge people and try and get those views out into the world? I mean, the reality is they have a platform. The platform isn't as big as Netflix, but the platform's still pretty large. So it's always a balance that you're kind of trying to figure out when you're making these types of films. I think these views need to be challenged. I think the Manosphere exists regardless of whether Louis makes a doc on Netflix about it. I think a lot of people already are aware of this. I think what it did is it made the people in that doc significantly more well known, specifically HS Tiki Toki, which, whether that's a good or a bad thing is depending on who you are. But I think there's a value to now people are extremely aware of it. I've had I've seen a lot more people. I mean, for me, I was kind of like, oh yeah, this is obviously a thing. We've been making docs on it for years, but a lot more people are coming to it now and being like, wow, this is an issue which has to be valid in some way.
This thing about with HS Tiki Toki becoming more kind of well known, this is something that I thought was really interesting. Wasn't necessarily the doc itself, but the aftermath that then came out of it. The thing that I've seen that's come out of it is that HS Tiki Toki has become a total laughing stock, which, while that's interesting to see, that's like culturally important, because so much of the Manosphere comes down to, particularly that kind of influencery side, comes down to cultural capital, right? It comes down to who do young men look at and think are cool or worth looking up to. And what I think the documentary did do really well is that it mainstreamed him in a way that wasn't particularly appealing for him. I mean, I've lost count of how many memes I've seen about him asking, like telling his mum that he doesn't want a juice bar or something like that. And those are coming from mainstream influencers, mainstream YouTubers and TikTokers who aren't associated with that sphere, but who think this is funny and who are then making jokes about it. And that to me, if that's happening, then that's great, because you're having the attention pulled onto somebody, but essentially saying this person's not cool anymore, this person's not important. And amongst young people, that's key. Taking the wind out of somebody's sails and saying you're going to be well known, but for essentially being a bit of a mummy's boy and giving a very awkward Louis Theroux interview, if he's well known anyways, then that works.
I mean, it's an interesting thing of the fickleness of a lot of this world, because I think like we chatted in our little research chat around like Andrew Tate's kind of massively fell off in some part because he got beat in a boxing match by a guy who's not very good at boxing, and this whole thing is that like Andrew Tate's meant to be this like hard kickboxer who can like smash anybody, and it is just the ridiculous fickleness of kind of like your entire persona being that you are this kind of like alpha male who is just the epitome of masculinity. And I think that is what's interesting, is like quite often when it is brought out into the wider mainstream, there is an opportunity, hopefully, people to be like, oh, it's just a bit ridiculous, isn't it? You're just a bit of a loser. Like, that's not how they're not the things we should value as a broader society. So yeah, I think that is interesting. I mean, HS Tiki Toki, there is a core set of the fans who just will support them regardless. And like, there's been HS Tiki Toki, and Piers Morgan has become a thing. It's just mad. Like, why is this the world we live in? Like that is now another bit of content. This is mainly my reaction for all this. I'm just sitting there like, wow, like this is just a joke. This is the internet. But yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, when you said about through challenging them, he really, I mean, that's not his style, but he didn't really challenge them particularly. And I think that's the contention of a lot of people, is like, if you're going to talk to these people and you're going to be filmed by them, you really do need to challenge them a bit more firmly than is his usual style. But what he showed are these, not just the ridiculousness of their ideas about masculinities, but he shows the inconsistencies, HS Tiki Toki being told by his mum to wash the floor better, or Myron standing there with his girlfriend's little fluffy white dog. And you see the kind of lack of coherence, those sort of fractures in the narrative that show that it's a performance, and they are selling it to young men to make money out of those young men. They're not really wanting to help them. Well, it doesn't seem like they want to help them. They have targeted a market, young men who are not being served by school, who are not going to go to university because they can't afford it, who want to learn something, and who are looking to these guys who are selling them something to learn. And it also showed, in answer to your other question, which I didn't really answer, is that these guys are also peddling a lot of extremism, the anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories. Andrew Tate has, he's used real white supremacist language about black men coming into this country. And he talks about this as a mixed race man. And he will talk about himself being, I know what these men are like because I'm one of them. You white guys are going to have to really train up to beat me and to beat them. So you need to start training now. This is kind of the sort of language from Tate and his brother that we saw in 1800s America. So to have that exposed and to say, look, these are not just misogynist, actually, and that's bad enough, but they are also anti-Semitic. They don't seem to care what they're selling. They're selling what sells and what's shocking. And that is hugely damaging to vast tranches of society. And yet there are still boys who will get cultural capital through that masculinity, that idea of power, money, girls, being able to treat your mum. They're all like, my mum doesn't have to lift a finger now, So this is, at least he did do that. And I think there is something to be said for that.
And how do you think that those attitudes can be challenged? I mean, obviously we were just talking about kind of by challenging these people, by making them look ridiculous and so on. But what else can be done to make sure that these kind of misogynistic attitudes don't filter down? There's obviously that tech regulation piece, but then what is there to be done in schools or sort of culturally as well?
There's something that I always sort of think about in this, and it's about you see a sort of legitimate grievance, illegitimate target, right? So it's the thing of, it's something that I work a lot as well in the sort of like anti-migrant sphere, and you'll see people on protests who say things along the lines of, I'm struggling to pay my bills and put food on the table, and these immigrants are being given everything. Most of them aren't lying when they're saying that they're struggling to put food on the table and pay their bills, okay? They aren't lying about that. It's that the finger is being pointed in the wrong direction as to who they're blaming. And then the behavior that comes afterwards, if that individual then, puts a brick through a hotel window, the behavior is completely inappropriate for the initial grievance, which to be true. Similarly, with the Manosphere, you have a lot of young men, a lot of young people who find the opposite sex terrifying because you're 14. That is legitimate. A lot of young men don't enter the Manosphere trying to enter the Manosphere. They go in trying to get dating advice, or they feel insecure and they want to have a better body, or they want to eat better. And it's about meeting those things with better responses, because at the moment, they're sort of looking for arms to fall into. And if the only person whose arms are open is Andrew Tate, that's the kind of way that they tip. So, and that's not to say that the individuals don't exist who promote those things in a good way, but it's just that, again, I'm going back to algorithms, sorry, but the algorithms don't promote them. If you're looking for content about, how to get fitter, because of the way that algorithms function and that they push content that's more controversial because it's more likely to keep you engaged, they're more likely to throw something at you that is an individual who goes to massively extreme lengths, like looks maxing, to fix that problem for you, rather than somebody who says nutrition is really complex and it's going to have, a lot of parts to it, and you're going to have to work on this, and it's going to take a long time. It's about the fact that the initial grievance, feeling scared, feeling lonely, wanting to improve oneself, that's not an issue. It's then how that's met.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think in a lot of our work, we kind of try and spend time with these dudes, and we do actually see some kind of change, even just in that kind of sense of exposure therapy, which is quite often we're meeting guys who literally are spending 90% of their time alone, often in their house, not doing much, and as a consequence, are just kind of falling deeper and deeper into the space. And there's a sense that it's quite often it starts from that they've been rejected by women or whatever, but it's usually just that they feel depressed and they feel like they don't really know what to do, and they just start kind of looking for answers, and they fall into the part of the algorithm that basically is telling them, it starts with you're just ugly, and maybe you're just worthless, so maybe you shouldn't even try, or you're ugly and you can bone smash, and then you can kind of change your cheekbone width, whatever the freaking like millimeter is that you need to get to. So I think, you know, quite often in my work basically becomes like me talking to these guys and them literally just sense checking me for like what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, because they actually just don't know, because they've kind of just lost a grip on reality. I can't actually explain how isolated they tend to be. Like they, you know, they'll usually, the way we kind of make these docs is it'll usually be like a member of the team, usually Ben there with the cap on, or Freddie next to him, reaching out to someone on some kind of, you know, putting a comment up on a forum, for looks, maxing or gooning or whatever, rent a girlfriend, and then we'll get like kind of people who will respond, and they're kind of like reaching out quite often because they are literally unsure as to like what is okay, what's not okay. And then when I'm interviewing them, they'll start by saying the most offensive stuff, and they'll like kind of just embody the worst parts of the internet. And as they're spending time with us, they're kind of like increasingly realizing that there's aspects of that just are not okay at all. And then in quite a lot of the films, we've tried to like create these scenarios where they talk to kind of either therapists or me or women and try and kind of get some of those thoughts to be challenged a little bit. And I would say it falls away so quickly. It's not like quite often it's not like this deeply entrenched idea. It's just their kind of current working model of what they think is right based on the random shit they found on the internet, but it's usually not making them feel very good either. So like there just needs to be an alternative solution to it, but that's not simple, because it also means, I remember I asked an incel like what he wanted to do more than anything, and he said, I want to go and play table tennis in a table tennis club. That was the first answer. And I was like, what do you mean? Yeah, exactly. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, I just want to play table tennis with some people. And I was like, okay. And I was like, should we go to the pub? And then he had assumed that like if we went outside, he kept telling me there's a loneliness epidemic, and that if we went outside there would literally not be anybody on the street, because he had been told that. We went outside and I was like, what's it like? And he was like, I'm just surprised there's people out on the street. I was like, who do you think delivers the milk in the morning? You know what I mean? It's like, clearly people go out on the street. But I think there's just like, there is like a complete lack of, like there's a loss of reality within that like is actually very, it feels super extreme, but not that uncommon. You know what I mean? Like, which that needs to be resolved.
I think it's quite interesting that, you know, there's a real lack of agency for those young men. You know, they are really wallowing in self-pity for whatever reasons they have ended up there. And that's where Tate is doing something, and these kind of influencers are doing something a bit different, because he is really abusing young men. Like he calls them losers, you know, they're not as good as him. They are like, you know, in row whatever of the plane while he's on his private jet. He's absolutely abusive to the people that are following him, but he's offering them something. He is knocking them down to build them up through his courses, obviously, to sell them something. So he is giving them a form of agency that actually that misogynist incel online forum world is really not giving them power. That everything, all the responsibility is being shifted onto women, which is very worrying. But in terms of, you know, what we can do, and there's been lots of talk and lots of articles about, you know, male role models. But you've got kind of two sorts of options. And I see this with extremism, counter-extremism work. You know, there's kind of lots of former extremists, you know, who went off and were fighting in Bosnia or Afghanistan. And they do work with young men. And a lot of it will be about, you know, let's do boxing or let's do something really masculinist. So it's the same kind of values, but redirected into a different kind of outlet. Or you can, you know, so Al-Qaeda recruitment is a little bit like the British Army's recruitment. You know, it's about camaraderie, it's about bonding, it's about adventure, it's about, you know, having something to fight for. So either you can stick with that kind of dynamic and those values, or you can try and dismantle those values completely, which is much more difficult to kind of to do. And I don't know, I mean, I know plenty of, you know, countering violent extremism providers who do this, you know, and it takes ages. It's kind of one-to-one, which you seem to be quite good at actually in your programs, you know, really kind of engaging with people, gaining trust, and then drawing them out. But I think, you know, trauma, mental illness, a high number of people, young people radicalizing, many of them on the spectrum with ADHD or autism, but these can't be excuses for why people who are lonely are joining these very, very harmful communities, which are making women, especially young women, you know, limit where they are online, limit their behaviors online, and limit their behaviors offline, and are really damaging trust between men and women. So it's a really difficult question, and of course the question of where tech comes into this, and there's so many bad actors out there who are making so much money off of this that it's hard to know. It's hard to know how this will go. Humour seems like a good thing. Like undermining happened when Islamic State. There were lots of those. I don't know if you remember those people putting duck sort of heads on Islamic State videos. So I don't know what the one answer would be.
This way. Sorry, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So if you could put your hand up, we've only got one person with a mic at the moment, so it might take a minute to get to you. You're very welcome to introduce yourself, but you don't have to either. So yeah, over there with the cap.
Hi, thank you. I was just going to say, where do you rank the potential for extreme violence from like incel groups or manosphere groups compared to maybe like neo-Nazi far right or religious extremism, given that there seems to be quite a large number of people online who support incel manosphere, but we don't see maybe as many terrorist attacks as these other groups?
So this is complex because it comes down to how we quantify violent extremism and how we define it, right? When you look at neo-Nazi or white supremacist terror attacks, they are the violence that is born from that ideology is a form of violence that we understand as violent extremism, right? It's a mass shooting, it's a stabbing. The form of violence that I imagine comes from an incel perspective. So if you spend time in those spaces, they aren't promoting murder, they're promoting rape. We don't see, currently legally, we don't see rape as a form of violent extremism, if that makes any sense. So, and this is only a sort of theory. My perspective is that I think violence does come from manosphere ideologies, but the reason that from a statistical perspective it can look off-kiltered is that the violence it produces doesn't tend to be a bombing or a shooting, it's interpersonal. So a guy who's radicalized into that might rape somebody or sexually assault somebody or grope somebody on a train. There's a form of violence that's going on, right? And he'll feel that that's justified because of the ideology, in the same way as a white nationalist who shoots people justifies that through his ideology. It essentially just functions in a slightly different way. And there are many, many discussions as to how we define terrorist violence that we probably don't have time to go into now. But that's my sort of perspective on it, that the violence does occur, but it's interpersonal rather than it being a kind of having the theatre of what we would consider a classic terror attack. If that makes sense.
I would, it's really hard to get misogyny taken seriously. And because the British legislation is around ideology, and misogyny, it has not been recognised as ideological. Somewhat similar to far-right ideology for a while. People would say, everyone would be on tenterhooks. Is it terrorism? Oh, it's a white guy, so it can't be. Because far-right is seen as a mental health issue. And I think we've moved beyond that now, but we are still in that same space when it comes to misogyny. So Jake Davison, so the guy in Plymouth, I can't remember what year it was, that wasn't a terrorist attack, but actually it had all the hallmarks of an incel terrorist attack, if we thought there was such a thing. Canada has been a bit more proactive in this way, a bit more kind of progressive, and unfortunately they've had more terrorist attacks. So they didn't start off categorising this as terrorism, but they have ended up doing so. Fortunately we have not seen, and hopefully we won't see that kind of public scale violence. I will mention one other thing just in relation to violent extremism generally, is that gender-based violence is a programme of violent extremism, and we see it in kind of, so-called Islamic States, systematic enslavement and rape of Yazidi women, for instance. And, international law, United Nations Security Council resolutions really kind of are very clear that gender-based violence, including sexual assault, should be considered part of that. So we're sort of getting there, but it tends to be based on responses to events that have happened in groups that have come forward. At the moment in this country, it's the far right anti-Semitic attacks and still threats of jihadist, Islamist plots, essentially.
And another one over down here, I think. Oh, yeah.
I have two quick questions which are sort of linked around women in this whole space, and the extent to which female journalists can adequately cover this space. Presumably they're not going to be given the same sort of respect that the likes of yourself or Louis Theroux are given in these spaces, and whether that's a difficult thing for female journalists to try and cover. And then simultaneously, there's also women who are helping propagate this space. We've seen in so many documentaries women kind of surrounding themselves with these sorts of men, and how much criticism should be laid at their door, or in some sense, or are they just sort of using their cultural capital to make money where they can as well?
I mean, just, I suppose, on the journalist point quickly, I mean, this isn't kind of exclusively Manosphere, but something that has become more of an issue for reporters is people kind of live streaming journalists when they're asking questions and posting that online with, things being taken out of context or sort of framed in a certain way. There is certainly a perception kind of in relation, especially to covering the far right, that there is a lot more risk involved. I have colleagues who've had their addresses posted online, who've had people turn up at their door, who've had kind of videos of them sort of disseminated online. So it's definitely becoming a slightly kind of more stressful and riskier space in that sense.
I think in terms of, I've done some work talking to actually academic researchers who work in these diverse spaces, so looking at extremism of different types, about the harms that they face. And it was very clear that people who were in marginalised positions, so Muslims who were researching jihadist terrorism, women who were trying to research misogynist incels and the manosphere, were much more vulnerable. But they could still do it. They were doing interviews, they were, so it's possible. And I've talked to the far right. You have to be so careful. And I've had I've had bad experiences myself, but you don't want to be deterred from shining a light on things, because often it is those people who are the closest to a form of extremism that want to shine the light on it. It's women who want to shine the light on, not just women, also ally men that want to shine these lights. So it's important that we can, but it can be, we know of journalists who've been doxed, trolled, who've had to take restraining orders out against far right actors who have sought to harass, bully, intimidate them into silence. And that is what they want. That's the control of misogyny, to ultimately silence women, stop them from having their careers, and remove from that space.
Yeah, I mean, my wife does a lot of work in these spaces and challenges people. Her name's Isabel Young. She's an investigative journalist. I think I think there's actually there's a skill to her kind of doing it, because she's done it. One of her best pieces, I think, was actually in Afghanistan, where she's kind of highlighting the treatment of women there, and she's talking to an imam who thinks that women should be allowed to be raped, and because of the fact she's a woman in that scenario, and she's challenging him, it's actually about 10 times more powerful than it otherwise would be. So I think there's a value for both. I mean, the thing about the manosphere is it's not about men, it's about men and women. I think there's a value to having lots of work in this space that challenges the thinking from kind of many sides. And I think it ultimately, it is just kind of about how we operate in terms of our relationships with one another. That really is what the story then becomes. I think there's also loads of stories around when you talk about women in the space, like one of the docs we want to make now is about trad wives, fascinating, the kind of flip side of all this, and kind of like the rationale there. And again, it becomes they become social media influencers, they start making money from it. So I think there's so much kind of there around like how the kind of female influencers fit into this place and how they profit from it, that is of interest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually really, really pleased that you've said that your next doc might be on tradwives, because as that was brought up, I thought, oh, that would be a really good one.
I really want it. If anyone knows any tradwives who want to be in a doc, talk to those two there, because we are actively recruiting.
But I think there's, with this thing about having, it's a broader cultural thing, isn't it? I think we like to have this idea that there's the manosphere and then there's the quote unquote normal side of the internet, and it doesn't really work like that, because it all kind of permeates and mixes. But this whole thing of where women are drawn into it, and the language changes, right? So there's a lot of content that I see at the moment which talks about things like feminine energy and being your true feminine self, and it all sounds very whimsical and lovely, and there's certain ways that you could take it where you sit there and you think, yeah, I understand that, I see what you're saying. But a lot of it links ultimately into very, very traditional gender roles. And there's this sort of slightly pseudo-scientific, pseudo-spiritual aspect to it, where they say that the only way that a woman can be happy is if she lives a soft life. You know, she has her pink job and her husband has her blue job, and she does pink workouts, which involve, you know, walking up some stairs briskly. And you have this idea where it's playful, it's not heavy, but that makes it much more easy to consume. And it's this underlying thing of, in order to be a woman and to be happy and to be fulfilled, you have to subscribe to this softness and this kind of innate femininity in order to feel right. And then for men to fit into society and be happy individuals, they have to be hypermasculine and in their masculine energy. So it feels very consumable and harmless, but a lot of it is just the same rhetoric that's packaged in a slightly nicer way.
And I think that isn't necessary. I mean, that's not harmful in itself. Like, I think lots of people believe this. They think that, lots of people think that men and women have different roles. And there's nothing extreme about that. It's when you start harming other people through the imposition of those ideas that it becomes extreme. And it, of course, that is very much mobilized by different varieties of extremist groups. And women absolutely buy into this idea that this maternalist activism, that their place is in the home, and that, you know, women should be mothers, and those women who are out there front and center are, you know, letting the side down. So it's really interesting gender dynamics in the times we live in. But too interesting, really.
We've got another question over here.
Hello? Is that okay? Hi, my name's Renee, and I work in sexual health. I've worked in sexual health clinics for over 30 years, and I've never seen the increase in sexual assaults that I've seen in the last several years. And we're seeing a lot more non-fatal strangulations coming into the clinic as well, and we're really wanting, you know, we're building up some work to present at the British Association of Sexual Health on this. But whether the whole thing, violence against women and girls, is tied in with this whole, the rise of this manosphere taking off, and how we can sort of counteract it. Can we get on TikTok and, you know, can we sort of grab the headlines and explain things as well? I mean, there's this whole thing too, like, oh, she gave me an STI, and it's actually, well, you guys get symptoms, the women don't. And so we sort of see it sort of coming out in this sort of ferocious way as well at work. And every Monday morning we're seeing so many sexual assaults every Monday morning at work. And a big rise in, and I know that Andrew Tate had put out a video about saying, take hold of your woman by her neck. And then that seemed to be in direct correlation with like 7 non-fatal strangulations we saw at work several weeks later. So how can we combat it? With more regulation, with education in the school? How?
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, that's and I guess I'm a documentary maker, so from a documentary standpoint I was thinking, can we film, you know, it's kind of, can we film in a clinic like that and kind of see the real world impact of these ideas? I think that's something that people don't quite see, you know, and that isn't kind of kind of platformed in that sense of seeing actually the consequences of these ideas, trying to figure out, is there a way to kind of FOI clinics to get a sense of the numbers of how these trends have changed over time, to potentially be able to tie them back to some of these ideas that are coming out. So it's some way of kind of making it clear to people that bad things happen as a consequence of these ideas. People are picking up these ideas in a way that you wouldn't quite understand, and actually seeing the real world impact of it. So I think a documentary would be a fascinating place to start in terms of highlighting the issue.
I think, one of the things that we didn't talk about when we discussed actions that we could take was, the kind of social media bans that have been obviously implemented in Australia and elsewhere. And again, there was a lot of kind of fevered debate about whether this is desirable, whether it's workable, whether it is, whether it would just be a good normative move. But, we do know that children of both genders are seeing really extreme types of pornography, which is they're becoming completely desensitized to this. It's normalized. We've had government campaigns on consent for years, actually, education campaigns. But those campaigns, are really fighting against a tide of directives from Tate alikes. And that's extremely shocking that you're seeing that in the clinics, but I guess not very surprising. So perhaps when you can't educate people with the same kind of authority that these manosphere influencers can direct young men, and young women are bearing the bruises and the physical outcomes of that, and for the rest of their lives in terms of trauma, it does beg the question of, do we need to be thinking about much more forcible kind of ways to stop this being disseminated. And I haven't really been for a social media ban. And I know that there are lots of young people that will say, well, we've seen all this stuff, but we're fine. And there is a way that we can resist it, that young people are resilient, that they have agency in pushing back against this as well as buying into it. But nonetheless, harm is definitely being done.
I'll go for one in the middle. Over here, on the right here. Sorry, I'm trying not to point. Yeah, sure. Go for it. So long as there's a question, it's all good.
I'm interested in where you think the evolution of the manosphere is going, because there does seem to be a trend, whether it's aging out of the manosphere, whether it's getting in trouble with the law. When you look at Andrew Tate, both got arrested for, it was either sex or human trafficking, and then losing his boxing match, which is quite a tank in sort of his popularity. Then you look at Fresh and Fit, where you do see online a lot of the clips where the woman they're trying to embarrass on their podcast does slip back on them, or whether his co-host doesn't necessarily agree or align with, I can't remember the man's name, Marlon, something like that, his views. Those do become popular, and then again we see a dip in their popularity. If we look at Clavicular, he was recently in trouble with the police, and then there's a bit of a drug issue that is being displayed online. Even HS TikTok, him getting embarrassed in that Louis Theroux with his mum, kind of being a bit of a mummy's boy, but then on his streams showing a very different story. There does seem to be either aging out, or whether there is a boundary with the public saying you're not untouchable. There is a line the public do draw with them. Where do you see the evolution of the manosphere going?
I mean, I think they've always been touchable. I think it's just that now there's a lot more eyes on them, and the reality is they always had a bit of a lifespan. I don't think it's like they were just like indefinitely going to be like the biggest things on planet Earth. I mean, they're kind of, as I said, I'm always torn between like a big part of it is basically like a reality TV show as a kind of live performance. I think with the likes of kind of Kick and Twitch, like the live streaming platforms, they're incentivized to make it as insane as they possibly can. Like there was that scene of like Clavicular and Nick Fuentes and Sneeko all singing kind of Hail Hitler, the Kanye West song together. It's like, even that, you're like, you don't even know how much they believe these things, and it doesn't matter that much anymore. So I think it's more just that the attention economy has got so wild that people are just doing more and more to stay relevant, and you are actually incentivized to just do crazy shit, because you'll get some kind of ad revenue, or you'll get some brand sponsor who'll pay you to do X, Y, and Z. Once you've got an audience, you can monetize that audience, as Clavicular is now doing. So I think all of them have a lifespan. There is a bigger problem of, what do these platforms promote, and what are you incentivized to do? I think that's more difficult to resolve, because I think like HS Tiki will have a lifespan. He'll die out at some point. I was thinking this the other day, like even with Clavicular, like what's he do when he's 50? You know what I mean? If this whole thing is looks, like he's not even that's being generous. He's not going to last until he's 50. Like his whole spiel is just saying the same thing over and over again. Like there's a finite amount of time people are going to put up with that, but someone else will come, they'll push the brand juice even further, they'll do something even crazier, the internet will reward them for that. So I think like they aren't really the problem in that sense. It is what the internet is rewarding, and that the extremities are what works, and you can make money from that, which then there's a question of like, is it a social media ban, is it more regulations with like Ofcom in the UK of who can make content? It gets into kind of more complex chats around how media should be regulated. But like these guys are going out for like 8 to 10 hours a day. They're like, it's basically I always think about it in that it's basically a video game. They're video game characters. The audience are people who play video games, and they're just acting like Grand Theft Auto, and they're going around causing mayhem, and they're profiting from the mayhem that they're causing, and then they'll probably get arrested or die at some point, and someone else will come along and just pick up the mantle, and that's basically all it is. So like they will just keep doing that as long as they can make money from it. The question is, how do you stop them profiting from it, which is more complicated.
I think there's another thing going on as well, where when these people are kind of pulled out of their echo chamber, right? Because we can all look at them from that external point of view and say, these people are wild, this is really strange. But a lot of them function within a network of individuals who reward their behaviour and aren't pointing out that what they're doing is necessarily wrong or off kilter. The thing that, in my opinion, seems to work is when they're faced with somebody like Louis Theroux, who they aren't used to dealing with and kind of comes from the real world, if that makes sense, because they're then faced with arguments that they're not usually faced with. I mean, the fact that when, HS Tiki is saying that he doesn't actually care what he does to make money, he just wants to make money and that's it. And Louis Theroux immediately turns around and goes, well, that sounds like Bonnie Blue, who you were ridiculing earlier for what she does. That's a logical argument that most people would come up with, but one that clearly Harrison hasn't been faced with before. There was a similar thing where a couple of weeks ago, Clavicular was being interviewed by somebody whose name escapes me, and he opens his line and says, essentially suggests that the interviewer couldn't possibly be happy with how he looks. And the interviewer says, yeah, I'm happy with how I look. And you can see that he just he then just doesn't know where to go, because he's ridden in this echo chamber where everybody is unhappy about their looks. And he's faced with an individual where I think most people in society might have things they would change but aren't kind of smashing their own face with a hammer levels of unhappy. And you can tell that they falter. They don't really quite know what to do. So I think a lot of them actually being faced with individuals that aren't part of their circles, that aren't there to agree with them, but face them with what most people would respond with, is quite a good way to undermine them, and seems to be the way that some of them kind of peter off into.
I was just going to add there as well that I think in extremism have this idea of like life stage masculinities. So when men reach, fatherhood, for instance, or they get married and their values shift, it's a kind of, like you were saying, a natural evolution out of extremism, out of violence. But what we've got now is a situation where, there was the King's research just the other week, which said that, unlike other generations, younger men now are much less progressive. So this is a real change. And there's a gender divide between young women's values. So unfortunately, it's not just about the content that they're creating, it's about the market that there is. There are young men who believe that women should obey them. And they want this type of material. Not only that, but we have any number of world leaders and would-be world leaders who absolutely echo all of this and promote this. We've got, Trump rolling back on women's rights. We've got Vance talking about, and Musk talking about how many kids you can have, this idea that, women are really just good for breeding from. We've got Pete Hegseth has, written books about the war on warriors, the feminization of the military, leading to Western decline. So the evolution of this is that we are going to be, I really hope we won't be, but in some countries we're already looking at societies that have shifted towards this masculinist, militarist voting patterns, voting for these parties that are going to give men more power, and are pushing back on the idea that women's rights have gone too far, and for me that's the really scary evolution, is into fascism essentially and away from democracy.
I think, was it 1/3 of men under 25 saying that they thought women should obey men? I think was that the stat or something? It's really alarming. So I guess it shows that there's a kind of there's a legacy even if things are changing. We've got a question over here. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah, good. So in terms of I suppose it's one of these movements that kind of die by 1,000 cuts, right? There's going to have to be some concerted effort by both the general public and the legislators that is going to drive this away from, I guess it's already kind of going slightly downwards because it has been ridiculed for a while, and this is just another one of these moments when it's brought into the mainstream. But fundamentally, I do mod a few big subreddits on women's rights, and you do see quite a lot, as you mentioned, that these people do crumble under the slightest pressure, or rather sort of lack thereof. They do not have any experience with the real world, and sometimes just actually being kind to them somehow completely shatters their entire worldview, because they are just so used to being in this combative, extremely sort of fragile and vulnerable space, and they do try to mask that, and the moment someone's nice to them, it sort of just goes all down. But on the other hand, as you said, there's also a huge value in kind of the ridicule of it, at least as far as the main people like Andrew Tate go. When we see that this is all a performance and they actually have this kind of very odd, sort of pathetic side to them, it does help break the spell that they seem to have over these men. And then again, conversely, when we do have these kind of mainstream challenges to them, not having especially male journalists speak up against the ideology more vividly, it can end up just giving them more space and just kind of perpetuating the ideology. So I was wondering, in terms of the general public, given so much of this is driven by the algorithm, is it best to kind of just actually not engage at all and just kind of, have instead of trying to argue or trying to ridicule, to just really let the algorithm kind of kill it? Because at the end of the day, every single share that they get is giving them money, and every single dollar that they make, they just invest back into this enterprise.
It's a good question. It'd be interesting to, I guess I don't understand the YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok algorithms well enough, but I think, the reality is obviously the rage baiting people to comment on the posts, because the comments will mean the posts get shared even further, and their currency is rage. So if it's generating arguments in the comments, which it will be, then that's value for them. There's also the whole kind of industry around how it works, because a lot of these guys aren't even putting the clips out themselves. They're basically doing a Kick stream or a Twitch stream. They'll have clip farmers who will basically just be pumping out clips. They'll be getting paid for the performance of those clips. So it'll be random people in another country clipping up their video, being paid some kind of fee for how that video then performs. So they just it's like Andrew Tate didn't have an account for years on TikTok, whatever, but he was all over TikTok. He was the most kind of searched person on TikTok. So they have a way to kind of show up in these places, even though when it's not them doing it, they've got armies promoting it, and their currency is kind of anger. But I think you can't really rely on people. It's a bit of to just inherently ignore it, can you? Because people will just interact with it. It's too hard to ignore, because it is just even me, I know Clavicular's nuts, but it's so difficult not to watch a Clavicular video because he's so fascinatingly insane.
Yeah, I think this thing of things being fascinatingly insane, Louis Theroux, his you know, the documentaries that he's made are built on being fascinated by people who are extreme. You know, it's just that now we don't need Louis Theroux to make a documentary about a very extreme white supremacist group in the corner of America, because now that group has Instagram. So they can sort of do all of the promotion themselves, and we can get that fascination through them. I completely agree with you. It's really hard to get people to completely disengage with it. And if we did that, we wouldn't all be on the stage talking about it, because there is this element of engaging with it rewards it. But then there's this other side of making it known that it's happening. I think what's hard is that kind of for people below a certain age, it feels like common knowledge. And then for people above a certain age, it feels totally new. I mean, like when Adolescence came out, there was a pack of people in a certain age bracket where nothing was new of it. It all felt very familiar. They understood what was going on. And then for others, it was like a whole revelation. I think because of the way that the online world works, you're functioning in almost two separate realities. So in some ways, the promotion of these people works because it makes parents and adults more aware of what they're dealing with. So I'm happy with it in that regard. But then at the same time, you wonder whether you're promoting them. To speak to your point, whether you were saying whether you meet these things with like kindness or ridicule, the way I'd approach that is you differentiate between what I consider like the person in the phone and the person holding the phone. So there's always an audience and then whoever's on the stage, right? So there's the people making money off of it. I think ridicule can work really well for them because it all comes down to cultural capital, who's cool, who's worth following, who's interesting. But then for the person reading it, like as you were talking about earlier, a lot of them, when you allow them into reality and meet them with a level of kindness, the performativity kind of fades, and a lot of them are very scared individuals. Doesn't mean they're not capable of harm. That's, you know, that's in itself doesn't mean they're not capable of harm at all. But I think that you can have two at once. You just have to differentiate the groups that you're meeting them with.
Yeah, I think empathy is really important, and you can only really have empathy with somebody when it's hard. When they're not somebody that you agree with, that's when the empathy is the most meaningful, and that's when I think it has the biggest bridge to cross. And empathy one-to-one, I think, and trust building is really important in any kind of intervention work with extremists or radicalized people. But then you've got a kind of responsibility when it comes to dealing with a group, a collection of people. So if I was going and talking to extremists, I could have perfectly nice conversations and be empathetic and chat about, you know, dinner and hobbies, and because we're getting on with each other as people. But I couldn't write about them in that way because I have to step back and look structurally at the damage that they're doing and, you know, take a critical lens to that. But there's definitely a role for empathy. And unfortunately, I don't think we can ignore, because there are so many networks of power between these people. You know, if you look at the linkages between people who have power in the United States, between who Elon Musk is promoting, far-right actors who are linked to these people in the Manosphere. You know, they are a network. I mean, they talk about the matrix, but they are their own matrix of people kind of promoting one another into positions of power and money. So I'd love to say if we ignore them, they'll go away, but I don't think that they will.
Thank you. Just to kind of segue off of that last point you made about if we ignore them, they might go away, but chances are that they won't. Are there healthy male role models in this space who you've encountered? And what is their role in kind of pushing back against this?
Oh, I mean, it's a really difficult question, I guess, because I'm not really seeking them out in that sense. Yeah, I'm trying to think who is a healthy male role model. I mean, I guess just guys just being normal human beings and being a productive member of society. There's a lot of people, you know, like kind of, I guess the majority of people on the internet are probably quite nice and normal human beings. You know what I mean? I think the problem is like, yeah, can they catch the algorithm? I keep saying the algorithm, but can they catch the attention in the same way is much more difficult. So obviously that's why these people get kind of platformed in a different way. This is the worst answer ever, but I can't really think of anybody who I'd say is like a really healthy role model.
I mean, I suppose it's sort of connected, but I mean, one thing that people do say is that not everything that these influencers promote is bad or unhealthy. I mean, some of it is about fitness, it's about kind of motivating yourself, all of that. There are some, I suppose, healthy ideas within them, but names of people who are actually like
I mean, like,
something different.
There's a lot of, so one thing I was talking about earlier where you've had like mainstream YouTubers and those sorts of people who are now essentially mocking HS TikTok because the content is good. Those are the sorts of people that I think are quite effective. You know, there are lots of collectives of sort of like British YouTubers who have got decently high followings, who are groups of men who hang out together and go and do silly things. You know, they'll go and, you know, have a competition of who can eat the most like chicken wings or something. And it's pure silliness. And I think the thing that's important is that when you have something that's a positive male role model, as soon as you put that sticker on it that's positive male role model, there's an element of it that becomes a little bit cringeworthy and it puts people off. And I think it kind of comes back to that thing of it can sometimes be why sometimes like government initiatives on this sort of thing can be felt clumsily, is because anything that you put in has to have a level of cultural relevance and people don't like feeling like they're being preached to. So I think if you're going to have men who end up positive male role models, really struggling to say that, they can't wear it on a t-shirt, if that makes any sense. They have to fit the mold naturally, otherwise it feels manufactured and it puts people off.
So yeah, no names then. All right, yeah, another question. Should we go at the back, Emmy?
Hi. We agree that there's kind of been different evolutions and waves and generations of this sort of movement, if that's what you want to call it. There seems to be one that's coming through recently that I don't know if this is a evolution or convergence with something else, but we're seeing a wave of sort of fundamentalist, nationalist, semi-right-wing version of Christianity. And I've seen stats where the kids who were influenced with this a couple of years ago are now massively much more keen to be in church and are going to much more regular churchgoers. And so, without kind of making any judgment on positivities and negativities of that, but where does that lead, do you think? Where does that social movement kind of evolve from this? Do you agree that there's a relation there, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've looked into these worlds for documentaries. I think I think that it all stems from a place, in my anecdotal research of meeting guys in these spaces. Like I think, including people in, I suppose, more conservative religious movements, there's a general feeling of like kind of loneliness and confusion in the world that people are trying to fill. Obviously, like it's well documented that kind of we don't have the same kind of religious environment that we used to. So people don't go to church in the same ways, and we don't have the same kind of place that we'd meet other people and feel a sense of connection. So I feel like there's a natural sense that people are looking for meaning in a world that's kind of devoid of meaning. I think there's also, as you're saying, a kind of interesting like right-wing spin on that, which is that the country is kind of being taken over. And one kind of antidote to that is to kind of lean into the country's Christian heritage. So I think there is a kind of blend of like masculinity meets kind of fear of migrants, meets a sense of kind of loneliness and lack of community that is all converging into kind of exactly that. I think Tori Robinson's big proponent of that. But there's a bunch of other figures like evangelical churches are getting bigger and bigger in the UK, which is fascinating. So yeah, I think it's a similar part of this world, I would say.
This is an area I find really interesting, so I'm just kind of gathering my thoughts for this. There has been a trend from my perspective that what we see in the Manosphere, a lot of, if you go back to your sort of 90s American evangelical purity culture, that kind of really big rise that happened and kind of fell away. A lot of the arguments that were used in that period that were very extreme about gender and about sex and about how we all relate to each other, I think some of the Manosphere ideology today really mirrors. I mean, like the idea of like sexual market value reeks of purity culture, and this kind of idea that a woman is spoiled if she has sex and then is kind of ruined for the man that comes next. You know, that's something that you could slot into that really kind of old school evangelical purity or a kind of incel narrative. And then you have this thing of being a good Christian wife. I think something that's really important here as well is that this is a hijacking, right? This isn't the majority of Christian institutions in the UK are not happy at all when people are kind of labeling Christianity with this. This is about a lot of these people knowing that if they stick a religious sticker on their opinions, it acts as this kind of gold badge of like legitimacy, and they feel that they can get away with more because they can do it under a guise of Christianity. And that's what it is. It is a guise, it is a hijacking. As I say, like the vast majority of mainstream Christian institutions reject these ideas and are very very upset about people like Tommy Robinson using these ideas. So it's definitely something that's coming within the far right, and I would argue within the Manosphere as well, but mainly because people are seeing it as a really good vehicle culturally.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, the far right groups are basically sort of saying to the state, you are not serving us. We are a sort of substitute for the state, but we will be based in this idea of, white nationalism. So if we take some of the trappings of state that gives us legitimacy, Christianity has a natural idea of gender binary to it. Tristan Tate is Christian. Andrew is apparently Muslim. They're really, they're doing this to corner a market, but I think, Robinson is interesting, again, this idea of life stage masculinity, and also being funded by really conservative people in the States for whom Christianity is really important. When I was going to like far right demos for research, nothing about any of the protests Tommy Robinson was involved in were disciplined, had any of the kind of trappings of state. It was all about, drunk people going to the pub, getting on the bus, and then, shouting really offensive things, marching around towns. Whereas something like Britain First would start their meetings or their protests with the Lord's Prayer. It's like a very different projection of identity there. So I think this is all very strategic in terms of, positioning yourself to have appeal in certain ways to certain people. And it's very, very powerful, as you say.
Over here in the right, the red, sorry. The right.
You're sort of touching on this a bit, but I'm really interested in it. You said earlier about a lot of these people having legitimate grievances, but the finger is pointing in the wrong direction. It just made me think of reform and like right-wing politics in general, like not obviously extreme, but also kind of increasingly within the realms of normal. And you talked a bit about that in the US. I just wondered what you think about it in the UK, and what is that crossover between this online world and very real threat of kind of extreme right-wing political power in this country, and what that actually says about democracy and who controls it. I mean, that's obviously a big question, but
there's this kind of where the finger points, right? So it comes back to that thing of, you do have people who are struggling a lot financially, and you do have people who are put in difficult situations, or have their own grievances that we know are real. And within the Manosphere, we do know that there are a lot of young men who do feel quite lonely. I would argue that often comes down to the idea that men caring for each other deeply in friendships is seen as like cringe or kind of weird, or men can be kind of put off by that because it's seen as unmanly. I think that can convey a lot of feeling lonely and struggling. In terms of the kind of broader kind of politics, I think it's definitely something that we're seeing, and it's something that historically has happened a lot, because it's a responsibility thing. Instead of putting the blame at kind of specific governmental decisions or saying this was the thing that went wrong or that was the thing that went wrong, it comes down to scapegoating, where it's a lot easier to just point a finger at a specific outside group and essentially say that, well, if we just deported all immigrants, Britain would be great and everything would be fine. We know that that's not true. We wouldn't be fixed of our problems overnight. And in the same way as really within the manosphere, although they might say so, if all women became immediately perfectly obedient overnight, chances are they probably still wouldn't be happy. It's just a more convenient argument and much easier on the brain, right? To just kind of go, that's what's wrong, because it's less nuanced, really.
I think we're also living in a real, sort of populist moment globally, and these people are, they are populists. Tate is someone who's, been talking about global elites that are not serving the people, and he is authentic. And this is kind of, the same language of Farage, of Trump, that these people are claiming to be real in a way that politicians aren't. And they have been part of why, there's many reasons why, but they're part of the story of the undermining of faith in politics. There's lots of other reasons as well. So it's a moment in which these voices that have this claim to authenticity through using coarse language, through, being, Trump's being abusive to journalists, and, or just in the encounter in Japan, this week, this kind of just the opposite of diplomacy, the opposite of imposing any forms of rules or standards on what you say. You will say anything because you're authentic. That's the kind of argument, and that is the populist argument. So, these two things go hand in hand.
Thank you. Hi, I'm doing an investigation into an online platform called School, which is just school with a K, and it's being used to host these looks-maxing schools. And obviously there was Andrew Tate's Hustlers University and stuff like that. And I was wondering, do you think that these pseudo-educational platforms give the teachings more credibility?
I guess. Yes. I think more importantly, they give them an engine to finance what they do. I think, ultimately, they're all kind of desperate to find a way to fund their work, and I think they kind of all create these kind of universities because they're desperate to find a way to kind of have some kind of retainable income, and and they do it. They'll, you see this in the Louis Theroux doc actually, where the guy is effectively selling Andrew Tate's kind of courses. So I think I don't necessarily think it's the platform in and of itself. I think they've all kind of just created, they're all desperate to find a kind of retaining revenue stream, basically, and that's been proven to be quite a successful version of it, because they're saying they're solving a problem, and this is part of that solution.
I think also, this is a real pushback against the idea of academic elites, like these woke, feminized institutions where gender ideology runs rampant and everybody's being, brainwashed into some sort of liberal ideologies. Jordan Peterson, Trump, these business schools where you learn actually the sort of how to really get on in life as a man, this kind of much more masculinist approach to education really hits the spot with a group of disenfranchised young men. We live in vastly social unequal times. It's really hard to, social inequality has never been greater, has it? People are not going to be as well off as their parents. We aren't seeing a golden age of people whose parents didn't go to university, going to university. So there is a lot of social inequalities. You say there are a lot of genuine grievances, and these people are trying to, plug a gap. They're very clever people. They really are. They really have spotted a gap in the market, and they are providing something for those boys. You know, how well it serves them, I don't know. Not very well on the evidence that I've seen.
And also, just as a more kind of like general point, that pseudo-scientific edge is a real kind of hallmark of the manosphere more generally. You know, even if you look outside of that area, I mean, if you go into any kind of incel environment, the obsession with evolutionary biology, very incorrect interpretations of evolutionary biology, but they see their ideas as scientifically backed. It's not just a social ideology to them, it's a scientific ideology. And they ride on this idea that women are biologically geared towards the top 20% of men. The arguments that they use, they feel are genuinely scientifically backed, and that's something that's quite important to them. You know, if you're in these kind of like looks maxing spaces, there's numbers, there's statistics, there's measurements. It's really, they see it as a real fine art. So just as a more general point, that kind of pseudo-scientific thing is huge.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, I don't know what's happened in terms of education, but it is really linked to kind of the idea of eugenics and the Nazi past, the idea that, you know, your genetics are really important, and they are important enough to mean that you are not even a person. So there's been a kind of delinking between sort of, you know, just in the space of, I don't know, sort of 70, 80 years, 2 generations, there's been, people don't seem to recognise the things coming round again, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the sort of scientific studies taken out of context is sort of another one of the kind of hallmarks of that misinformation, isn't it? Great. Well, we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. Obviously, it's a difficult choice. There's a lot of hands still. Thanks very much for all of these. Shall we go this guy at the back, the unloved back?
Yeah, from the unloved back. Thank you very much for the talk. It's been very insightful. I wanted to ask, just based on the interviews you guys have had with people who were young men and adults who have entered the manosphere, what has helped them come out of the manosphere and kind of go through that process of de-radicalization? And what do you think we can do as a society to help people come back from inside this very toxic space?
I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, I've done stuff in the manosphere and I've done stuff with conspiracy theorists, and it's a little bit like talking to someone who's been kind of radicalized by a conspiracy theory, really, which is like, I mean, the first point is kind of like empathy and kind of trying to find some sense of initial commonalities. Like the way I usually approach it when I'm interviewing these dudes is like, I treat them as human beings, because that's what I generally do with people I interview, but it's like, it's trying to kind of understand, like, you know, a sense of something that we can find common ground on. I actually don't really scream at them. I'll try and kind of point out the kind of, you know, I'll ask them, you know, I'll try and point out the things that are a little bit more hard to believe in what they're saying, and try and get them to kind of deconstruct it for me a little bit. And then usually in that process, they start to kind of untangle their own web at least a little bit. And then I think, like, you know, it depends where they are in the journey. I think by the time I meet them, it's for a documentary. So usually it's at a point that they're trying to understand their world a little bit more, or maybe trying to kind of find a way out of it. But then there is an element of, like, yeah, that kind of sense of exposure therapy, that they are a little bit, they are quite isolated often. So just the process of, like, getting them out into the world, talking to them about their problems. And it always ends up boiling down to, like, they feel like, you know, they were rejected, they were socially isolated, they didn't know what they want. I mean, they didn't know how to kind of be in life. They might not be able to get work. They feel a bit pointless, and just kind of walking through those feelings with them a little bit, and then kind of pointing out that the solutions they've landed upon might not be the solutions that work. For X reason have they tried this thing. So I think you know, I can quite often, I'm like, on a one-on-one level, I can totally see how you could resolve that with people, because I generally think most people are redeemable and want to find a way out. And the thing is, they're not often happy about it. They usually feel terrible, you know, so it's not making them happy anyways. That's usually the easiest place to begin with. The problem is, how do you then expand that on a societal level with a load of young men who feel maybe that life isn't working out how they want it to, because you can't send loads of documentary makers to go spend time in the house necessarily. So, you know, and I think, like, most of them need a kind of combination of community, therapy, better teaching in school, less access to the internet, a bit more time outside, which is a bit more of like but there's a lot there. They need to touch some grass. Yeah, exactly. Even the fact that you know the phrase "touch the grass" shows how mainstream this has become. You know what I mean? Because that is such a phrase from the world of kind of insult, in that sense of like touch grass, is nuts that has become so mainstream. All right.
I was just going to say that, I think that the kind of, with Tate, the kind of I've been getting his emails for like 3 years, and they sometimes really cheer me up, which is a really terrible sign, I think, because he's using quite cult-like techniques in terms of breaking people down, blaming them. So getting out is even harder when someone's been using those techniques on you and trying to separate you from other people who don't agree. But, and I haven't talked to people who've come out of extremism or the Manosphere. Unfortunately, I've only ever talked to people who are in extremism. But, talking to prevent officers who do get people out, again, it's about trust and it's about one-to-one relationships. And I think it is worth noting that that Tommy Robinson himself did, he was once the decapitated head of the EDL, I think was how Quilliam had put it. And that went all very wrong and has led us to where we are now. But at the time, he said that the reason that he didn't want to be part of that anymore was that his children were being bullied and he was sick of being like stigmatized when he went to like pick up his kids from school. So it's also about the impacts on people that around you that you love. Okay. He did take £74,000. He took lots of money from Quilliam, but that's what he said at the time, and it is an opportunity that went rather wrong. And Quilliam's involvement is rather, and he's not a good example for people who've been de-radicalised. Thanks, Taz, for that. Thank you.
I haven't spoken to people who are on the other side of radicalisation either, so I will leave that to my better informed colleagues.
All right, well, that's a good moment to end on. Thanks very much for all of your questions, and thanks very much to our brilliant panellists for an interesting chat. Yeah, well done, guys. That was really interesting. I'm going to trust my instincts. Yeah.